the reason why Chernobyl seems such a dire warning to so many people around the world is the nuclear disaster that happened there affected the entire planet.
I remember the first time going to the site itself. It's a sinister place because you can't help remembering what happened there and how it had affected hundreds of thousands of people's lives.
2 miles from Chernobyl, the city of Pripyat, once home to 50,000 people, lies in ruins.
Vegetation is taking over. There are trees that are growing into the upper floors of the tower blocks.
A 1,000 square mile exclusion zone has restricted access to the site for the past 36 years. But that all changes on the 24th of February, 2022. When Russia invades Ukraine in a bid to take back the former Soviet Republic. An early strategic target is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
Russia was moving tanks through the zone, and that raised radioactive dust. Russia is really weaponizing nuclear power plants in this war on Ukraine.
The story of Chernobyl is decades in the making. It began when the emerging Soviet Union's nuclear power program threatened the world.
История повторяется, не знаю почему, плохо только, где хорошее.
A Soviet dream that became a nightmare. A disaster officials tried to cover up. As a brave few battled to stop radiation spreading across the globe. Using top-secret Soviet documents and hearing from those who risked everything. This is the story of one of the world's worst nuclear accidents. Early morning. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant gets ready to carry out a safety test on reactor number 4.
Every nuclear power station has to undergo a series of tests. And one of the safety tests that it needed to prove to continue to operate was to test what would happen to the coolant system if there was a power cut.
Engineers planned to switch off 4 of the pumps to test their backup systems.
If there was a power cut and the emergency generators didn't kick in, there would be a real problem.
The job was extremely difficult and complex and demanded a lot of concentration, a lot of experience.
It was kind of a routine test, but it was conducted in such a way that that routine test turned into a terrible accident.
The Chernobyl disaster can be traced back to the 1960s, when Ukraine was part of the USSR, and harnessing nuclear power was a major Soviet ambition.
A multi-stage rocket took off from a launching site in Russia.
The mid-20th century was the height of the Cold War. Rival superpowers, the Soviet Union and the USA, are vying for technological and military supremacy. The USSR is determined to lead the world in harnessing nuclear power, and it pours vast resources into nuclear research.
Nuclear power was enormously important to the Soviet Union, and scientists were these heroes of the Soviet Union. And nuclear research was the flagship of what Soviet science could offer.
Soviet leadership plans to build a vast nuclear power plant, one which would dwarf any the world has ever seen.
The reason why they wanted to build such a large reactor, the biggest in the world they hoped, was national pride. The Soviet Union at the time was engaged in not just an arms race with the United States, but a cultural, political competition to prove themselves that their system of government and life was best.
The new plant is to be built in the Ukrainian wilderness, 60 miles north of the capital, Kyiv. It's named after a nearby town, Chernobyl.
Ukraine enjoyed a special status in the Soviet Union. It was very important economically. It also contained very important industries on its territory, coal mining industries, of course, and many others. A very important member of the Union for political, strategic, military reasons, economic reasons especially. It's on the borderland, facing to the west. It's also a showcase of Soviet modernity.
In the winter of 1970, the man chosen to build and run Chernobyl arrives in northern Ukraine. Despite having never worked with nuclear power, 34-year-old Viktor Brukhanov will be Chernobyl's first director.
Viktor Brukhanov was a young man when he was picked, surprisingly, to take on the Chernobyl project. He was an electrical engineer. He'd worked in a couple of power plants across the Soviet Union, but this was his first nuclear power job.
Engineer Nikolai Steinberg worked on the project with Brukhanov.
Я еще с несколькими директорами работал, но это был первый и единственный мой директор. То есть, есть же директора, которые у него одно мат и кулак, стучащий по столу. За ним это, в принципе, не числилось никогда.
His main deficiency was that he was never trained as a nuclear engineer.
Да, он не был реакторщиком, но он быстро вошел в ситуацию, в ту, которую должен понимать директор.
The real reason he was picked was because the authorities thought he was the man who'd be able to master a very, very complex, difficult task.
Construction of the huge power plant gets underway in early spring 1970. The first of 6 planned reactors will take 7 years to build.
На Чернобыле, работая там 5 или 6 апреля 1971 года, когда там был песок, лес, вода, ничего другого. Но это реально, это все на твоих глазах. Ну, понимаешь, чисто если поэтически, то вот как ребенок растет.
As the power plant grows, so does the city built to house its workers. Pripyat is one of 9 atomgrads, or atomic cities in the USSR. Each one is built from scratch for workers of the nuclear industry and their families.
Pripyat was a city whose reason for existence was Chernobyl. And in many ways, it was a model Soviet city. It was what a socialist city was supposed to be like.
The apartment buildings were very well made. The shops were stocked, which was quite unusual in Soviet society, especially in the 70s.
Меня послали туда вместе с семьей, в Припять. И мы жили там. Такой прогрессивный был городок. Каждый вечер, каждый выходной вечер у нас в центре выступали оркестры, самодеятельные или приезжие, гуляли с удовольствием.
Chernobyl's 5,000 workers and their families lived just 2 miles from the power plant. Seven years after work began, Chernobyl's reactor number 1 is finally ready to be switched on.
Сентября в 20 часов 10 минут мы включили сеть. Я был на смене. Монотонный гул, теплее. Разогревается все это. Потом начинает жить, и все. А пошла эксплуатация.
Plant director Viktor Brukhanov is now at the helm of Chernobyl's first reactor and is charged with building 5 more. But it won't be long before Chernobyl suffers its first accident.
Пришло оповещение, что авария. Назвали на втором блоке.
And the authorities are quick to cover it up.
Тогда я не знал, потому что Советский Союз, я на 3-м блоке, это первый, все было секретно.
Three nuclear reactors are now fully operational at Chernobyl. The completion of a 4th will make this the largest nuclear power station in the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian city of Pripyat, built to house Chernobyl's workers, is also flourishing. In 12 years, it's grown from a wasteland into a city of 50,000 people.
Несколько раз, и это заметно было настолько, это было, ну, как сказать, прогрессивно и так сказать, повышало настроение, мамаш. Такой коллектив, там такие и дороги, и все. Мамаш, это было чем гордиться, это точно.
Although they live in a Soviet paradise, the residents of Pripyat are unaware of the danger they're in. The new Chernobyl power plant is already riddled with problems. But it would take until 2020, when the Ukrainian government released thousands of top-secret documents, that Chernobyl's early safety problems were made public. One of them exposes how unsafe the power plant is becoming.
The report is dated from January the 5th, 1983. And according to this report, between January 1978 to December 1982, the Chernobyl nuclear power station experienced 27 accidents and 87 equipment failures, including 5 accidents and 16 failures in just 12 months of 1982.
One of the most serious accidents happens in late summer. Chernobyl's #1 reactor undergoes a routine safety test. Nikolai Steinberg, head of turbines, is in his office in the 3rd reactor building.
Как-то ни странно обнаружил его я первый, потому что у меня...
Outside Nikolai's office runs a ventilation pipe connected to reactor 1.
Прошло оповещение, что авария. Назвали на 2-м блоке. Я повернул почему на голову машинально, увидел, пар идет из трубы.
The steam is part of a major radiation leak. Reactor 1 is shut down. Nikolai waits for a briefing on the incident from his bosses.
И я сразу ребятам сказал, домой не идем, сейчас будет общий сбор. Вот, аварийный. Но общего сбора не объявили, мы где-то в час ночи сели на машины, разъехались по домам.
The cause of the accident is kept secret from Nikolai and his colleagues. One reason for the secrecy is down to the presence of the KGB, the Soviet Union's secret police. They're a constant presence at Chernobyl.
Well, the KGB's job would be partly to investigate whether this was an act of sabotage or whether there was someone who was simply negligent, but also part of their job was to contain rumors and to prevent the spread of panic.
The KGB investigation is more concerned with quashing rumors than uncovering why the accident happened.
They do talk about the presence of distorted rumors that spread by residents of the city of Pripyat. And this is kind of a nightmare scenario for the Soviet authorities that rumors will spread. None of this was reported in the press.
Причина тогда я не знал. Такая схема у нас работала. Косвенно догадывался. Деталей нет, почему произошло, а что произошло, и официально не было, никто не знакомил ни с актами, ни причинами и так далее. Такова была страна. Как говорится, все секретно и ничего не тайно.
After the accident, radiation is detected 9 miles from the plant. In some areas, the levels are hundreds of times higher than normal. But the residents of the nearby city of Pripyat are kept in the dark. Despite the accident, Chernobyl continues to grow. It's now 13 years since work began on the plant. Managers are under orders to complete the 4th reactor by the end of the year. Engineers like Vladimir Kagan are feeling the pressure.
Наша работа была очень такая интенсивная в моменты, когда приходится вводить блок в работу. Это очень плотно, потому что все сроки постепенно откладываются.
They were incentivized to get jobs done by a particular time. And this meant bonuses, this meant certain perks.
То есть сроки остаются те же, надо вводить и все. И нам приходилось и днем, и ночью работать. Бывает по сменам, бывает как угодно.
The people who were able to meet those deadlines, they were rewarded, and that was part of the game.
By the end of December, Reactor 4 is near completion.
Everything had to be finished by December. That's when the bonuses were handed out.
But before it can become operational, the reactor must undergo a critical safety test.
The turbine test that was the last remaining test that was due to be done on the Unit 4 reactor hadn't been done by December.
Carrying out the test now will mean a delay. The reactor might not be ready by the December deadline. The decision on whether or not to go ahead with the test falls to plant director Viktor Brukhanov.
So Brukhanov said, OK, we'll sign it off, and then we'll come back and do it at a later date.
Despite the safety test not being carried out, Brukhanov allows the reactor to enter service.
He was someone who was taking risks. He believed calculated risks. He lacked really deep understanding of what he was running.
With Reactor 4 online, Brukhanov is now in charge of the Soviet Union's biggest nuclear power plant. Spring 1985. Events in Moscow are about to put nuclear energy at the forefront of Soviet politics. The USSR has a new leader. Mikhail Gorbachev's arrival heralds an era of transformation in the Soviet Union.
He was seen as a new, different type of leader. He had a meeting with Margaret Thatcher in December 1984. They famously get on very well together. There's a feeling, I think, that things are beginning to change inside the Soviet Union.
He understood that the Soviet Union and Soviet economy, especially, were in need of reforms, and he was willing to undertake that project of reforming the Soviet Union to save.
One of Gorbachev's first tasks is to announce a plan to revive the economy, made to an audience of 5,000 high-ranking party members.
Gorbachev presided over the party congress, and that congress adopted a resolution to double the number of the nuclear reactors that they would build in the next 5-year plan. So nuclear energy was supposed to be a solution, or at least part of the solution, of how to drag the Soviet economy out of that stagnation.
In the audience is Chernobyl's director, Viktor Brukhanov. He will be held personally responsible for helping meet Gorbachev's ambitious goals.
So the pressure on the management was actually now becoming even stronger, and the burden on their shoulders was even heavier.
Chernobyl's 4 reactors, known as RBMK reactors, are of a type unique to the Soviet Union.
The RBMK reactor was really advanced for its time, much more so than Western reactors, and this was because it could put out the most amount of power for a reactor of its size. This also meant that it was really cost-effective, which is why they were able to build so many across the Soviet Union.
In total, 17 RBMK reactors are built. All produce energy in the same way.
Effectively, the nuclear reactor is like a kettle. It's generating steam by splitting uranium atoms to generate the heat. The heat then is used to heat water. The water is then turned into steam, which turns turbines to generate electricity.
Reactor number 4 has been running for 2 years when the long-delayed safety test is finally scheduled to take place. The test will be overseen by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov.
Dyatlov was one of the few people at the top who was trained as a nuclear engineer.
Мы с 73-го года знакомы. Ну, как специалисты его уважали все. Немножко высокомерным. Довольно жесткий.
He had quite an abrasive personality. Dyatlov was very often feared, and he was using a very harsh language to deal with his subordinates.
The test will take place on Friday, the 25th of April. Dyatlov has briefed the staff, and they know what's expected of them.
But everyone turned out expecting it to be a normal shift. As it turned out, it didn't go that way. And not everybody would make it home alive.
Early morning. Engineers are preparing to carry out a safety test on Chernobyl's reactor number 4.
This particular safety test was designed to see what happened when the cooling water pumps lost electrical power.
Engineers will switch off 4 of the pumps which cool the reactor to test the backup system. And it has to be done today.
It was the last day of the week before the start of a holiday season in the Soviet Union. They were under pressure to complete the test, to complete the shutdown of the reactor before that holiday season.
Two miles away in Pripyat, Chernobyl workers and their families prepare for the upcoming May Day holiday.
It's a normal spring day with lots of people being about. This is late April in Ukraine. It's beautiful weather. Generally, the time when you felt summer is coming, the spring has turned the corner, it's going to be warm and lovely.
И мы на выходные дни поехали в Киев покупать дочке платье на выпускной вечер. Но все было так, мало ли что.
Back at Chernobyl, inside the control room, preparations for the test are underway.
It's a vast room, a giant curving control panel, strange paving, flooring. It would have been filled with smoke. Everybody smoked at the time.
Overseeing the test, Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov.
So Anatoly Dyatlov was probably the most feared person at the facility. If he was in the room, you had to listen to him and do what he said, otherwise there'd be trouble.
The test is due to be carried out by members of the plant's morning shift. They've been trained on how to carry it out safely.
To operate the test, the operators needed to lower the power output of the reactor. This makes sense. If you're going to test the brakes on your bike, you don't do it at 50 miles an hour, you do it at 5.
Operators have been gradually powering down the reactor since 1 a.m. By early afternoon, the power's been reduced to nearly 3/4 of the reactor's normal power. Inside the control room, the phone rings.
Partway through the day, the emergency grid controller asked them to stop lowering the power. The energy was needed.
300 miles away, another nuclear reactor has had an emergency shutdown. Chernobyl must keep producing power.
Rather than say, OK, we'll cut our losses and come back another day, Dyatlov decided, no, we'll carry on, we'll do it this evening.
For hours, the reactor continues to operate, but at a lower power. The operators wait for the green light to carry out the test.
They had to hold the reactor at a mid-power level for a longer period than was expected.
Inside the reactor, there's been a build-up of a dangerous gas called xenon.
No one really realized that while working at that lower power level, the reactor was producing the chemical elements. The so-called poisoning of the reactor was taking place.
Late in the evening, and the test still hasn't taken place. Chernobyl produces power 24/7, and there are constant shift changes.
The day shift transitioned into the evening shift, transitioned to the night shift. There wasn't the information passed through each of the operators from day to evening.
Не успели, не успели. В следующий раз. Вот так должно было быть.
New people came, the graveyard shift. People who thought that by the time they come and start their shift, the whole thing would be over.
After a 9-hour delay, the control room is finally given the go-ahead to carry out the test.
So it was the night shift that were conducting the test. It actually started about 11 o'clock.
Ordinarily, the control room was a quiet place, especially at that time of night. Because the turbine test was taking place, it was filled with people. There were more than 20 people in the room that night.
One of the operators working the night shift is Leonid Toptonov.
Leonid Toptonov was one of the 4 operators that took over the operation of the reactor. He was a young and very clearly talented engineer.
One of Toptonov's main jobs that night was to keep an eye on the power in the reactor.
The final steps to start the test are taken.
So having been left in this low power state all day, the reactor was extremely unstable.
The build-up of xenon gas inside the reactor is causing it to behave erratically.
Because the operators were relatively untrained and not prepared for the test, they didn't really notice the signs that the reactor wasn't in a safe state.
Operators know that if all goes wrong, there is a safety mechanism in place.
Такая максимальная проектная авария, которая везде проходила по всем системам, что если ее вводишь одной кнопкой, все это сработает автоматически для того, чтобы безопасно расхладить реактор и остановить все системы.
Inside the control room, something happens that sets alarm bells ringing.
The power dropped really unexpectedly, which was unexplainable to the operators at the time.
If the operators knew enough about the issues and problems, they certainly would avoid the accident.
Once power began to fall in the reactor, it carried on falling, and it fell to disastrously low levels. The reactor was now in serious danger.
Toptonov takes steps to raise the reactor's power level. But rather than bursting back into life, the reactor's power only creeps up to 1/16 of its maximum output. Xenon gas has poisoned the reactor.
The xenon in the reactor was reducing the activity to very, very, very low levels.
Toptonov can't increase the power to the level needed for the test.
People who were around him tried to help him.
Dyatlov, it seems, wanted to carry on with the test regardless.
An argument reportedly breaks out between Dyatlov and the shift foreman, Alexander Akimov.
They were seen having quite a heated conversation. And it's fair to assume that it was Dyatlov saying, I want to go ahead, and Akimov saying, no, we should stop, it's not safe.
For nearly 24 hours, engineers at Chernobyl's fourth nuclear reactor have been attempting to carry out a safety test.
They were going to turn off the cooling system manually and see what happened.
But even before the test starts, they're struggling to control the reactor.
When the experiment was started, it was already in an unstable state, but the operators didn't exactly know what was going on in the reactor.
Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov insists the test should go ahead.
Operators of Soviet reactors were kind of used to not exactly following the guidelines, partly because the guidelines were confusing, but partly because it was quite difficult to operate those particular reactors without doing a few things that you shouldn't really do. Operators, guys who were operating the controls, said we should stop. But Dyatlov just told them to get on with it. The experiment was started at 1:23. Four of the 8 pumps that were putting cooling water into the reactor, the power was taken away.
When the coolant system was switched off, that water was no longer coming up past the fuel rods quickly.
И реактор повел себя очень нестандартно, никто не знал этого. Пошел перегрев, несанкционированный, и все.
Any water that was in the system was boiled off. The water was no longer being used to cool the fuel rods, and it bubbled off into steam.
This kind of causes the nuclear reaction to actually start to speed up. So with more boiling, more steam is produced, the rate of fission increases.
Water that kept being pumped into the reactor with the aim of cooling it down had the opposite effect.
More fission increases, the more steam is produced, more bubbles, and it's a positive feedback.
It's a never-ending cycle until you get to a very dangerous, unstable point in the reactor.
In Reactor 4's control room, Leonid Toptonov is monitoring the reactor's power level. A few seconds into the test, he's scared by what he sees.
As the reactor overheated, Toptonov finally saw this. He called across, said temperatures are just skyrocketing inside the reactor.
With the reactor out of control, there's only one course of action.
The emergency button to shut the reactor down was hit.
The test had been running for just 36 seconds.
Instead of shutting down when that emergency button was pressed, the power continued to increase.
it keeps perpetuating, keeps growing and growing and growing. You have no water left in the reactor. You have just steam.
The fuel channels ruptured. The amount of steam increased.
You got more heat, more power, and a runaway reaction happened.
There's nothing that can be done at this point. The Unit 4 reactor explodes.
Водородный взрыв, сильный взрыв с разрушениями.
First thought that crossed the mind of some of them was, okay, it is probably an earthquake.
They wouldn't have been prepared for what had happened inside the reactor.
Two people die instantly in the explosion. Others are now being exposed to lethal doses of radiation.
Многих даже дежурных знали, которые умерли. На смене были в это время, которые приходилось принимать страшные решения. А что делать было?
Inside a nearby fire station, the telephone rings. The fight to save Chernobyl has begun. Next time, with radiation pouring out of Chernobyl's number 4 reactor,
все практически, кто были в этой зоне, все получили.
The Soviet government does everything it can to conceal the accident.
They couldn't control radiation, so they were trying to control the information.
With deadly consequences.
Nobody knows how many people died as a result of that delay.
It was the worst man-made accident in history. In the groundbreaking new investigation, we reveal there's more to the story.
None of this was reported in the press.
And why Russia retook Chernobyl as they invaded Ukraine. The Chernobyl Disaster, next Wednesday on 7 and 7+.